Here we will review a brief history of Ukraine until 1917. In the Middle Ages, Eastern Slavic tribes under the leadership of Vikings formed the Kievan Rus, a loose empire of territories, not a centralized state. Other ethnic groups also inhabited the Rus. After the conversion from paganism to Orthodox Christianity, the Rus became culturally over time more unified, however remained territorially divided in principalities, often fighting each other. Under the pressure of the Mongol invasion, the Rus disintegrated in the 13th century. This medieval state was neither Russian nor Ukrainian or Belarusian, but Eastern Slavic. The three mentioned nationalities needed still centuries to evolve. Obviously, already the Rus knew linguistic and cultural differences between different Eastern Slavic groups. Over centuries, languages and cultures changed, being influenced by different factors. Already in the 17th century, Moscow's emissaries needed interpreters for negotiations with Ukrainian Cossacks. Today, the difference between Ukrainian and Russian is approximately as large as between English and German. We speak about two distinguished and clearly different Eastern Slavic languages. After the disintegration of the Rus, first Lithuania became the dominating force in the western part of the realm. Later Poland took the lead and turned into the most important power of Eastern Europe. Many territories of Ukraine were ruled for centuries by Poland, which entered a commonwealth with Lithuania. For the development of a linguistically and culturally distinguished Ukrainian ethnicity, Polish influence was highly important. We have to note that Polish or Lithuanian rule, as well as later Russian rule, cannot only be seen as foreign rule, because local elites were incorporated into the political process. Belonging to Poland meant for Ukraine the participation in developments like late medieval scholastics, the Reformation or the Renaissance, and being part of the sphere of Roman law in Europe, or simply the autonomy of towns. Things which were not shared by the eastern part of the former Rus. This led to a situation that the Russian Empire imported until the 18th century scholars and clergymen from Ukraine because there were not enough qualified persons in Moscow's territory. Ukraine's first university is nearly a century older than Russia's. Under Polish rule, serfdom intensified as in all over Eastern Europe, and serfdom would last until the 19th century. The landed gentry thus dominated the life of the majority of the population and exploited them. One way to escape serfdom was to run away. The name Ukraine, known since the Middle Ages, can mean borderland, separate land, or our land. Runaway serfs could live in the borderlands, fight against the rulers of southern Ukraine, the Crimean Tatars, and thus receive a certain degree of autonomy. Cossacks were known in Ukraine and Russia, but similar developments took also place in southeastern Europe. Cossacks in Ukraine had to navigate between Poland, the Crimean Tatars, and later Russia, but were able to establish their own Cossack states by the 17th century. From the perspective of Ukrainian history, this fact is important, and Cossacks were even instrumental in establishing the first university. Since the 17th century, Russia gained a stronger foothold in Ukraine, and over time the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth weakened. In the late 18th century, the partitions of Poland ended the existence of this state. Poland was carved up between Prussia, Austria, and Russia. The majority of Ukrainians ended up in the Russian Empire, a smaller part in the Austrian Empire. This did not mean that Polish influence in the Russian part of the country disappeared overnight. For decades and sometimes up to World War I, Polish elites hold important positions. In the time of the partitions, a distinct Ukrainian ethnicity already existed, as did printed books in the language. Whether the members of these ethnic groups would be called Ruthenen or Little Russians by the empires. According to Czech scholar Miroslav Roch, a national awakening for an ethnic group requires different stages. First, a small circle of intellectuals deals with language, culture and history of a people. Second, the circle is getting wider and wider and is publishing actively. Third, mass media, political goals and mobilization of masses kicks in. Schooling in the native tongue is definitely a great advantage in the process. In the long 19th century, collections of songs and Cossack stories were published, the Ukrainian language was researched, first histories written. Activists might belong to the Ukrainian or Cossack nobility, but there were also Russians and Poles. Initially, the initiative was taken by the Russian part of Ukraine, which would also become economically more developed. With Taras Shevchenko, an author of enormous and international importance appeared. The mid-19th century saw important changes. The revolutions in Europe 1848 and the abolishing of serfdom in both the Russian and the Austrian Empire. In the Austrian Empire, the revolution led also to a mobilization of Ukrainians, although they were living in the poorest, least developed parts of the empire. A central council of Ruthenians was formed. Ukrainians were represented in parliaments. First newspapers in Ukrainian and first cultural associations appeared. Most important, elementary schooling in Ukrainian was introduced. The Ruthenians could adopt the techniques of other Slavic movements in the empire, which later became a constitutional monarchy with freedom of speech and press. In addition, later in the century, there would be Ukrainian secondary schools and single shares for Ukrainian studies at the universities of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. At the brink of the Great War, Ruthenians were true subjects of the emperor, while the Ukrainian movement has turned into a mass movement with some 500 cooperatives, clubs and associations and own political parties. In the Russian part of Ukraine, economic modernization led to increasing pressure for assimilation, because towns and factories were dominated by other ethnic groups, like Russians, Jews and Poles, using mostly Russian as a common language. Since the 1860s, repressions against Ukrainian culture and language increased. Ukrainian organizations were closed, printing and teaching in Ukrainian forbidden, apart for high literature. Ukrainians were seen as little Russians and to be assimilated. Elementary schooling in this language was ruled out. While the standard of living in Tsarist Ukraine was definitely higher than in Galicia, the center of Ukrainians in the Habsburg Empire, the level of freedom and the possibility of cultural self-expression was clearly higher in Galicia. The Austrian-Hungarian part of Ukraine might be seen as a Piedmont, especially concerning cultural and linguistical issues. However, with the first Russian Revolution in 1905, political activism became more visible in the Russian part of Ukraine. Ukrainian political parties were formed, other activists joined existing Russian movements. As a result of the revolution, newspapers and other publications in Ukrainian and cultural associations had to be allowed. Only elementary schooling in Ukrainian was not granted. Remember, this was one high point of Russian nationalism. However, the Ukrainian national movement became no real mass movement until World War I. Whether the vast majority of Ukrainians did pass all the stages of Roch's theory at this time is a matter of debate, especially regarding the fact that in the majority Ukrainians were still illiterate. Yet, in the revolutionary year of 1917, Ukrainians played an important role. After the February Revolution, the Central Council of Ukraine demanded autonomy for Ukraine inside Russia. Actually, Estonia did the same already a couple of weeks earlier, but if Ukraine received autonomy, this would turn the Russian state into a federation in the long run. The following dramatic events are illuminated in the next lecture.